We are still in the income-based education tax study committee. It is 2nd of December. It's a very nice water and stretch break. And now we are going to talk about the education fund, I believe. No? What's next?
Just for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. Would you like to just go through, there's one last question relating to how the non-homestead property tax would be set and whether the current sort of status quo would be retained. So there are two questions within this. One, would the non-homestead property tax be used as a flexible lever to accommodate any ups or downs in the ed fund? And if so, would it be tied to another tax rate? Again, that was the question that had come up more in the December 1st letter context of when calculating rates, would they be calculated to increase for the final tax bill at a similar percent, at an equal percentage? Do you want any sort of connection like that for the actual rate that's being set?
I think in our previous conversation, we said that we wanted to still be a flexible lever, and that while they should be set at the same change in the December 1st letter, we would like to retain the ability for them to change at different frequencies in actual session law.
And the second question following up on that, as a flexible lever, would it be statutorily required, which it is not currently? The current process is there's a default rate and then there's the notwithstanding.
I like the precedent of the scary default rate personally.
Yeah.
So it could stay the same. In that case, there would not need to be any statutory change at all.
Using last year's rate could become problematic.
So we're deciding that when we need to raise 10% more through the EIT, we would also be raising 10% more.
No, that's what the letter would look like, but we would still be notwithstanding. And so we could have one be 8% and one be 12% if we wanted to.
Or needed to. The revenue didn't come in.
Yes.
It's the big one.
That is the last decision point in the non-homestead property tax section. The next division on this list is looking at the education fund. The understanding from all of the discussions has been that the new education tax would be allocated 100% to the education fund. And that, this is actually reminding me, sorry, way back in the renter credit discussion, there are some questions here about which fund it would go into. I'm assuming that would also go into the education fund based on all of your discussions. There would be no other special fund or that would impact the education rate. Okay, thank you. Just want to cross off everything. Yes. Okay, so back to the education fund section is 100% of the revenues would go to the education fund. And then this brings up this ongoing question about where are the levers to pull in the case of underperformance or a strong performance of education income tax revenues. How would that difference be accommodated? Would there be any new revenue streams that would be coming into the education fund? Would the rates be increased or decreased? This was discussed earlier, allowing for an adjusted rate. I believe that answer was yes. And finally, would the stabilization reserve be amended in any way, or would a new reserve be created?
I think everyone's in agreement that we would need a larger stabilization reserve. I think the question of how big the stabilization reserve would be is a question that we would want to defer to JFO on some recommendations related to the idea is that we would be creating a bigger stabilization reserve because we are looking at revenue sources that are sort of slightly less stable. And so if you're able to model sort of the difference in stability between this revenue stream and the existing revenue stream, what you might recommend percentage-wise as a higher reserve
And am I remembering correctly that the present stabilization fund is based on what was the general fund transfer?
No.
It hasn't changed, even though we've changed the revenue source. And I know that there's formulas that Wall Street or whoever, the bond market wants in reserve, less the to make sure we can meet our. But it might be good to look at that because we've transferred in the last couple of years several pension payments into the ed fund. If we do this, we have more of the revenue coming in from taxes that depend on the economy, more so than the property tax.
Is your question, how would this affect our bond rating, and would we need a higher stabilization reserve to retain our bond rating?
I know that, yes.
Okay.
That's,
I just want to make sure I understood what you're
yeah.
saying.
Well, I think, and also, do we want to ask the question of, do we want to have a second? Do we want to use a second reserve? Like one, I mean, that's what concerns me about
Stabilization
our
reserve A and B.
Our existing, if we tap into our existing, then we get dinged for it with Moody's is, I don't know, I just like to understand that.
We do for the state reserve or the education, even if we tap in just to the education reserve, Moody's pays attention to that.
I think so, yeah, and which doesn't seem quite right to me. But maybe it's how we define what it's to be used for. You know, is this for a shortfall within the budget year? Or, like if we say, let's say we're going into, April and May, and we say, man, we don't like what the property tax rates are looking like. So we tap that stabilization reserve, bring it down to maybe 4% or 3.5%. That's different than you're in the middle of the budget year and an asteroid hits one of your schools. So I don't entirely understand how Moody's looks at that, but I think right now, the way it's set up,
It's just for the asteroid?
it's set up for the asteroid situation. And we're not talking about the asteroid situation.
We really want to be
So,
able to
yeah.
use it as a way of
Yeah.
keeping tax rates as sort of even state as possible.
Yeah.
The other question related to that I think would be helpful to get some guidance on is if instead of sort of kickstarting it with some magical cash infusion, who knows where that would come from, if we in fact built out our transition plan into this by building it up 10% a year or 20% a year, and then didn't actually even make this, maybe didn't even make the transition to an income-based education fund until we were done building up that reserve. How long might that, what would be a reasonable amount of time to take on that?
Right now, it's funded by excess whenever the education fund is in excess, they put some into the reserve fund.
No, so it's 5% of the, I'll have to pull up.
It's a really weird thing that it's 3.5%, 5% of something strange.
I'm going to actually, our statutes are down right now.
No, that's,
I'm just gonna go grab. But it's prior year fiscal appropriations.
Oh, yeah.
So
That could-
It's 5%. So like when we solve the yield model, Ed Fund Outlook, that number is not a function of how much is coming in, how much is going out of that year. That's like a given. We need X number of dollars to fill the stabilization reserve to 5%.
up to 5%.
I would
yeah.
say,
We have
some years you don't have to, depending on.
Yeah, right.
Usually it just sits there. Occasionally we draw it down and then we have to build it back up.
So am I right in understanding that while we experience it as it just sitting there, it is in fact sort of always part of building out the yield?
Correct.
Okay.
It grows every year, so we have to
Correct.
fill it at least that much.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you go and look at the Ed Fund Outlooks, I've got them. Just the one that I just published today, the December 1 letter, online, and we've got in FY '22, the reserve target was 39.3 million. That was the current year stabilization reserve from a prior 38.2. So it went 38.2, 39.3, 42.2, and now we're at 45. So it does go up.
Because the spending goes up. So it would only not go up if the spending didn't go up.
Right.
Yeah, but there's no universe where that happens.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's no, even if some other money came in, if the spending was higher, the reserve would need to be higher.
Right. Right.
And then if you spent it, then you have to make that up. And that comes from where?
Us.
It's the way the yield is set, like that's how we fill it with.
From the
property tax.
education,
Yeah.
from education property.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and sales tax and all the other revenues.
We have the revenue surplus, and then before that moves through the yield, but before that moves all the way to the bottom line of what's available, the amount needed to fill the stabilization reserve is pulled out of that.
Yeah.
And
Did you figure out what it's tied to? What is that? It's 5% or something.
so it's so I'll just read the whole section. So this is Title 16, Section 4026, subsection B. There is hereby created an education fund budget stabilization reserve determined on a budgetary basis and administered by the Commissioner of Finance and Management. Any budgetary basis undesignated education fund surplus occurring at the close of a fiscal year shall be reserved within the education fund budget stabilization reserve, provided that the balance reserve shall not exceed 5% of the prior fiscal year education fund appropriations.
Not exceed.
And then it's reduced by the amount that's distributed for netting purposes and any additional amounts as may be authorized by the General Assembly. And then there is another sentence about any undesignated education fund surplus and accrued interest remaining in the education fund budget stabilization reserve has been brought to the maximum authorized level shall remain in the education fund. So that's why there are multiple reserves within the education fund, such as what's been set aside in session law in the last few sessions for OPEB and PCBs and what else? Okay.
So it's 5% of appropriations?
The prior fiscal year appropriations in the ed fund, but also netted against payments made out to school districts.
Oh, okay. Okay. Clear as mud.
So
So you're gonna come back to us.
it seems like we're gonna, put a pin in that basic structure, but the numbers connected to it and the timeline connected to it, we're gonna wait on. Okay.
Yeah, we can certainly look into that. I just don't have anything prepared for today.
Thanks.
Move on to education payments, great. So this section is in black because the understanding is that cash flow would remain the same from your discussions. Correct me if I'm wrong. Education payments can continue to follow the same timeline, which is that there's netting between payments made from a municipality to the school district and then ed fund payments made from the state to the school district, which happens 3 times a year. Towns or municipalities are required to pay the state twice per year. And then I had put in that there is an 8% payment penalty that was discussed at length during the beginning of the pandemic for concerns about tax collections and such. So none of that structure will be changed.
And this is my moment where I say publicly, if someone from the Agency of Education is paying any attention to our work, this would be the time for them to speak now. Thank you. Onwards. Or email. But, yes. Back to you.
The next section is on what would be repealed under changing the property tax system to an education-based, or income-based education tax. So the homestead property tax would be repealed. And there are several important notes under this. As discussed in the non-homestead property tax section of this list, municipalities would still be conducting appraisals and listing homesteads, and the whole grand list would still be retained. I did want to put a note that the CLA would only be applying to the non-homestead, but values, because the CLA in Vermont applies to the tax rate, not to the value. But just wanted to flag that the CLA would still be in existence. So homesteads would be listed, but they wouldn't be adjusted by the equalization study. And then, as we just discussed, there would be this carve out for the house site, and then non-homestead tax would still apply. So that would mean homeowners, if they have a parcel of land that's larger than 2 acres, yes, their house site would be exempt, but they would still be paying potentially both the education income tax and the non-homestead tax. There's also the question of payments that the state makes to towns for conducting grand list maintenance and appraisals and billing and collecting. Those could all be retained if the committee were agreed to retaining all. I listed the 3 main forms of payment. Some of these were discussed last session. There are payments per parcel for appraisals, maintaining the grand list, and then billing and collecting education property tax. So those could be potentially retained for the non-homestead tax. There is an allowance. There's the 0.225% of tax collected. That allowance could be retained, but that would automatically be reduced because the homestead property tax wouldn't be collected. So that would be a smaller payment to towns. However, by repealing the property tax credit, there are some payments that municipalities receive now that they would no longer receive because they're not collecting the homestead declaration or doing any follow-up with the property tax credit. But that's a minimal, compared to the other payments that are made, that's probably the smallest one. So I'll pause there because that is all in black. There's an assumption that structure would not change.
Yeah, so there's a reciprocal reduction in work that would go along with the reduction in those payments, right?
Yes. The homestead property tax wouldn't, something that the town would be administering anyway.
A very significant reduction in work.
Property tax credit would disappear. So that's, I think, a large portion of that work, but I wouldn't want to speak for towns or clerks. And the next section is about the repeal of the property tax credit. And again, I put in parentheses, the renter credit would not be changed because of the history of the statute. That is in the same chapter of Title 32 in the same subchapter. General funding would continue. The question did come up earlier of if the household income form is disappearing with the repeal of the homestead property tax credit, what happens to the municipal super circuit breaker? So that is general fund funded credit against municipal taxes. And that's for individuals who have $47,000 of household income or below. If you no longer have the household income form, you no longer have you would still have house site, but you don't have the whole property tax credit calculation. How would those individuals be dealt with, if at all?
So here's a suggestion, because I was like filled with anxiety about this. And then someone made the suggestion that we just retain the form for only this purpose. And it would be many fewer people would fill it out or be subject to it.
This credit pre-existed, Act 60 and all, the homestead declaration. How did we do it before?
The version that I'm the most familiar with is what was enacted in 2018. So I would need to go back and do more research. But you're correct that at least in Act 60, it was always a $47,000 threshold. It's always been that amount. But I do not know.
Yeah, I can remember when it was 35,000.
And so there was some way that people shared that information with state government before Act 60.
It was the town, only a local property tax and local income tax. The town clerk probably already knew. But it was all local. And somehow,
To apply for it or something?
I don't know.
Was it covered by, and we don't know if it was covered by the general fund historically.
Right. So would that be based on state data being collected on adjusted gross income? What would be the threshold? Because you certainly still have information sharing, but maybe structured differently.
And as I've been thinking about this and the circuit breaker in the context of this change, I don't think it's, the League of Cities and Towns is very excited about the education income tax, partially because they're interested in having more capacity for municipal taxes, which they need, towns. I think that there are a lot of towns who could use a lot more revenue than they have. But while our education property tax is set up somewhat progressively, our municipal taxes aren't at all.
Right.
And so if that becomes a larger share of a household's total tax responsibility, I feel just,
Yeah, it's
nervousness about the implications of
Yeah,
that.
it is. It's going to grow.
It's gonna grow no matter what we do.
So we can,
I just remember when Act 60 went in,
Yeah.
some towns like Stowe are still reeling from the increase in their tax rates. Some towns like Montpelier were jubilant about the decrease. And that gave you more money because, you've been spending, 8 cents and now you're only going to spend 5. So, you can give us 2 and still save money.
So is there a question about whether or not we would want to retain the circuit breaker? Does everyone agree that we want to retain the circuit breaker? Yes.
yeah.
Okay. And so the question is how, and that the way it's administered for the most part seems to be working. The question is, if we are getting rid of the form, do we need a new form or can we retain the form just for this purpose? Yes. Is that the sort of remaining question once we?
Modify the
Okay.
form.
What's the form again? I'm sorry.
So right now, it's the same form they use for your homestead property declaration.
Household income.
Right, but it is one of the more confusing forms we have because you have to add things back in that you don't put on your federal income tax and take stuff out. And it's not an overly easy form to fill out.
But if
But it exists.
It exists.
and many less people would be using it
Why?
because people would be only using it for the municipal circuit breaker, which is a much lower income threshold.
Tiny
And
fraction of
Yeah.
income sensitized population.
Oh, but because the form is for both.
Yeah.
Fewer people would be using the form, but the same amount of people might use it for the circuit breaker.
this is probably the same amount of people would be eligible for the circuit breaker, but the only people using the form would be the people eligible for the circuit breaker. Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out. Because did we decide those folks that aren't filing income tax now don't have to file it? Okay. And then we've got the stupid circuit breaker, plus we've got all the child and earned income tax credit, all the credits we put in last year, which is going to reduce tax liability. And we're looking at some pretty significant increases in income tax for the upper income brackets. It'll
Do
be.
you mean if this becomes law? If
Yeah.
this becomes law?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, we're making a lot of changes and none of them have had time to kind of settle in so we know what, including all the changes we've made to the revenue sources in the ed fund. And then all the impact of the federal stimulus money on that.
No, the world is a very dynamic place right now.
It is a
Yes.
very dynamic, dynamic is probably the nicest word I can.
So I wonder if we could make the recommendation that the same form be retained with a request of the administration to simplify it, given the reduced use or something like that.
Another possibility is to use the definition that's used for the renter credit, because that was part of the discussion around why that was proposed and why that was enacted, was to simplify the filing for those individuals, specifically a lot of the losses and add backs that these individuals are probably not taking, that are many, many lines on a form that wouldn't apply to them anyway.
Sounds great.
Maybe as one option.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not an easy form.
And then the assumption is that this would be an education fund expense.
It's, right now it's funded by the general fund.
Municipal circuit breaker?
Okay, great. Yes, that's on.
We don't want to change where the money comes from. No, thank you.
Or would it be?
Stay with appropriations.
Right there with you.
I'm assuming towns would not be able to use their other revenues to provide services to their schools. That came up when we first did Act 60.
No.
Some schools were going to put the recreation program in the town and pay for it on their 28 cents municipal tax rate. So none of that will change.
Can't move.
Right, that is.
Can't switch some semi-educational cost onto the local, okay.
Yes, in repealing the homestead property tax and credit, that provision would not be touched.
Okay.
The last point in here is about repealing all references to the property tax credit. And then I've listed a few just to highlight them so that there are no surprises. Because one of the only exemptions for homestead property is for veterans. So just to point that out.
But if essentially
There wouldn't be a tax, so why would?
everyone is exempt, if everyone's exempt from the tax, everyone's exempt from the tax.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are they, I was thinking about this the other day. Veterans are not fully, is it
It's not a full exemption.
10% or something like that?
There are two actually.
I thought 100% disability,
Yeah.
some other qualifiers.
Disabled.
Yeah.
This is for the
There's-
state,
Yeah.
For the school tax.
There's also a town voted
right, the town vote.
up to a certain
Yeah.
value of property.
And it took money originally off your value of your property.
Yeah, it was just the chunk,
Yeah, like $2,000 sticks in my mind, but,
bigger than that now.
and when Act 60 came in, I remember Senator McDonald did a lot of work explaining to veterans that they would be better off going in on their income and then taking the money off of their, grand list.
It is, I mean, we've seen it with pensions. It's not a big political.
Oh, very political.
But we're not planning on, I guess I'm confused.
Giving a broader exemption.
Yes.
Yeah, we're expanding the exemption.
There's no more property
So we
tax.
can't retain an exemption when everyone's exempt.
But they no longer get special treatment, I guess.
We could leave the language there. It would be superfluous, but we could leave the language in the statute.
I think
Right?
that's what we did with Act 60.
I mean, if we just left the language in the statute, it would be, right?
I mean,
We could.
That's not.
That's a committee decision that's one of those decisions you make when you decide what it will take to get the thing over the threshold. The veterans haven't been as active as an organization as,
The retired ones have.
Yeah.
well, that's been more the National Guard people.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
ones that are gonna retire.
So. Are you looking at something that you
I
need?
was just looking at the exemptions
Okay.
because there are so many conditions, I can never remember them. Just that it's a $10,000 in value of appraisal value exemption for disabled veterans or their survivors. And then a town can vote to exempt up to 40,000. And there's a whole list of conditions.
Oh, but that's still like a decent amount of tax responsibility on those properties. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
great.
I mean, considering most disabled veterans aren't earning very much money.
Right.
This is what we did in lieu of exempting pensions. When they start yelling at us about not exempting pensions.
But we now do Anyway, well, let's not
Not
talk
all.
about
Not
military
all.
pensions and go.
That's right.
Onwards through this glorious outline that we are going to finish by 4 o'clock today.
So the penultimate section is transition and effective dates. There aren't as many bullet points here, but there are some large decisions. When would the homestead property tax be repealed and when would a new education tax be imposed? Would there be any lead time to implement a new structure? And how would the transition for people waiting interact with any new tax structure? To note, those take effect in 2025. And then there's the tax rate cost containment that is phased in over 5 years, so until 2030. So just taking those bigger picture changes into account.
Are those calendar years or FYs?
FY '25, people weights kick in.
That's what I thought.
And then
Okay.
fully implemented.
They're fully implemented immediately.
Yeah.
The new pupil weights are fully implemented in FY '25. And then there's that transition mechanism for tax rates cannot increase by more than 5% year over year.
Or decrease. Isn't that part of it?
No, only cannot increase by more than 5% year over year. And then if education spending is greater than 10% as compared to the previous year, then the district is subject to a tax rate review board in which they will look at the education spending and determine if it was or was not excessive. If it was not excessive, then the tax rate is capped at 5% increase. If it was excessive, then the tax rate cap no longer exists. And
That ends in FY '29?
that ends in FY '29. And if a school district does not use the 5% cap, 1 year they won't be able to use it in future years. So once you phase
You're out.
out, then you can't go back in.
And so that's calendar year 30.
If it's a 5-year and you start in 25, 26, 27, 29.
I think that it,
Or 28.
calendar
Sorry.
year 20,
8.
So the protection is in effect for FY '28, but then not for '29,
it's in effect for FY '29.
and then not for '30. Okay.
Correct. That's what I am remembering off the top of my head. But I know it's 5 years and I know it starts in FY '25.
Okay.
All right.
So I'm interested in the idea of building up a reserve before switching over systems. But I'm not attached to that idea. I just think it's a nice one.
Yeah. But there could well be a surplus, right in this coming year. So maybe we just sort of,
We could
I
say.
agree we should have a reserve. And I don't know that gets hinged to a calendar necessarily because a year ago we had $150 million surplus in the ed fund or something like that.
It's 64 this year. Sorry, taxpayer.
We're well on our way.
Well, we could say this year or when the reserve is met.
Are you thinking of it before we trigger this? We have to have.
We have to hit something in the reserve, yes.
Right now in the education fund, isn't there something that says that, isn't there surplus, is that just in
I
general?
think
fund?
reserves are supposed to default to rates.
Or was there a surplus go to the
Surplus go to
pension fund?
rates.
Is that just the general
That's
fund?
the general fund.
That's just the general.
That's the general fund. Okay.
Well, I mean, the way is I think.
And I think that's a temporary waterfall.
As you just, unless you think you have the discipline to vote for it every year, you put in a line item and say, we're gonna pump in whatever it is a year for 5 years. And
Plus any waterfall of some kind, but we don't have waterfalls in the ed fund because
Well, we did this year. We set stuff aside for the PCBs and we set stuff aside for universal meals.
we could always say any surplus would go towards this new
Transition.
fund. We could do that.
Have a separate
if I may, the one thing I would just note when thinking about surplus waterfalls in the education fund, and this is something that we weren't expecting when putting in the language into the yield model or the yield bill, last year, but was when we were going to calculate how much money was left on the bottom line when determining the PCB reserve fund. It was
Complicated.
it was a complicated calculation because there were dollars that were appropriated for future years and were not being used in that year. So it's just something to be aware of, that the waterfall in the education fund is quite complex.
But we've got a long way to go before we start trying to figure out the details of a transition. I mean, first, we've got to see how the weighting works out. And, whether schools just reduce their tax rates or actually do services and all those other issues. And we keep hearing rumors that school population is increasing, but I haven't heard that we have that number tied down either with people moving in. We've got time to figure this out and to figure it out the closer we get to it, because the national economy is still not overly stable. The national political scene is definitely not overly stable. There's a lot that could change.
That's why I was imagining that building up the reserve over 5 years or so would also align with the, pretty significant amount of time it probably is going to take to rework paperwork and do it well. And build up an appropriate sort of stabilization for that instability and match up with when people waiting was fully implemented and the protections were gone.
Right.
And so that sort of, we were having some implementation that was really lining up instead of adding instability to instability.
I think first thing we have to do is to see if you can get this through the committee process and the veto process, the veto override process. And once you do that, then step one would be to start filling the reserve, but to fill a transition reserve before, which means you're not using that money to reduce property taxes. You're going to get a lot of pushback. So first we have to say, this is what we're going to do. Then we start saying, and now we're going to start saving for when we do it.
Yes, so if this was in a bill that passed, it would say, we'll build up the stabilization reserve for 5 years and then switch over.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, okay.
Rather than prescribe sort of steps that sort of would be enacted now on the way, what about just sort of writing in a few of those conditions? You know what I mean? Like, we don't need to wonder if it's going to take 5 years or 3 years or 1 year. We ought to know some estimate of what tax thinks is realistic. If we can do it in 2 years, let's say. So to me, I would just pick some moment of time. Again, we're not deciding to do it. We're deciding kind of how one would go there. I don't know if that's a difference, but.
So the stabilization reserve should be built up to X percent through this method of building up a stabilization reserve. And when that happens, this kicks in.
Well, but
Not before, and not before FY
Yeah.
20.
or maybe the other way around, but like
Okay.
kicks in 27, assuming the stabilization reserve can be,
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
I mean, the biggest thing, how big is that? Is it 10 million or is it 50 million? What's,
And you need the reserve first. Yes, okay. You need the reserve first. We need enough time for tax to do paperwork. Yeah, and you need a mechanism for building the reserve. along with a target number for the reserve.
I think a policy question for the committee is, do we want it to be after the people waiting changes to take full effect? There's an advantage that I see of waiting is that then you could disaggregate the impacts of the two, that there's not an overlap. Maybe that makes it easier. So say if it's going to be fully implemented in fiscal year 19, so that would be the first year of implementing this.
I mean, given how much some towns' rates are gonna change, that feels comfortable for me, even though it seems very far away.
Yeah,
I get that,
that's-
but
Well, that's
and most,
it's a committee recommendation.
and the towns that it's gonna change considerably on tend to be the few towns that I think are gonna be sort of the most, need that protection from the rate increase the most are also towns that tend to have quite a lot of high income earners in them. That's your memory too, right? That's your memory of the towns too.
I mean, typically towns that have more income spend more money on education. I mean,
Yeah.
Does that feel clear enough to write down? Doesn't to
To be
me.
determined.
It doesn't feel clear enough to
But
me.
we're saying we want lead time and we want to build up the reserve. The only thing we haven't really said is, do we want to wait till after people waiting or not? As far as the questions that are here.
So, to follow up to that, I'm hearing, or I think it would be helpful to hear where you have all landed with respect to filling that stabilization reserve. Is there going to be something in statute that X percentage of whatever needs to go into that stabilization reserve? Is it up to the discretion of the General Assembly? How and to what extent it will or would there be guidance for filling the stabilization reserve?
I think before the legislature gives any guidance, we would need to be informed of what is. Like, for people that, understand how reserves work and what Moody's looking for and on and on and on, expertise that we don't have is somebody to give us a 2%, 3%. Maybe it's the same as the reserve, I don't know.
So in order to build it up, you need to know how we want to build it up. We need to know how much should be in there before we know how we want to build it up.
I
Okay.
think the treasurer's office could give us some guidance on that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know.
It'd be Beth Pierce's parting gift to us.
And I do think it is, yes, and we will certainly look into that. And if you reach out to the treasurer's office, I think that another one of the questions though is how much do you want that stabilization reserve to be used as a flexible lever? So that will really impact the size that you need. So if the whole point of these additional funds in the stabilization reserve is to in fact stabilize tax rates, how much stability does the committee want or need? Then in turn informs us for estimating the scope of a stabilization reserve.
So you're saying something like, okay, the reserve is gonna step in here if, there's more than a 3% dip or a 5% or whatever.
Mean a principle of
3%
Yeah.
in spending or 3% in
Income.
tax, your income tax
Income tax
rate.
base,
So
Base,
Yeah.
not the rate.
yeah.
for my thinking, the purpose of this reserve is to compensate essentially for the difference between the stability of a property tax and the stability of an income tax.
Right.
And so I would want to set that percentage that would cause it to kick in right around whatever we think of as sort of the higher instability rate of an income tax versus a property tax.
And I know when we went.
So if we know that property revenue tends to change by, X amount per year,
Yeah, what's the,
then how much, and income revenues tend to change by this amount per year, what's the difference between those two percentages?
Right.
Or we could look at the last recession, which was the biggest one we've had, how much did the revenue drop off?
Yes.
So we did present,
Yeah, you did.
back on, and I brought this just
Is that our first meeting?
Yeah.
October 26th, Graham and I put together a PowerPoint called Education Fund Budget Pressures, which we had an analysis where we assumed a 10% drop in the non-property tax revenues, what that would look like, and that was 75 million.
And did you pick that because that was a,
Because that was reflective of the previous 2008, 2009 recession.
Wait, it was a 10% drop was 78 million
75 million in non-property tax revenues.
in non-property. Oh, yeah, I see. That's tricky. Okay.
So that would include everything, yeah.
For the education fund specifically. So sales and use, meals and,
Right.
whatever is flowing into the education fund, if we were here right now, we were to see 10% drop in those revenues, that would correspond with $75 million.
So, yeah, so sales tax revenue dropped 10% that year,
All.
All non-property.
So
all
if
nonprofit.
we substitute, same economic scenario, if we substitute education income tax for homestead property tax and the same economic catastrophe, we would expect that it would go down by more than 10%.
Because you've got two
why? Oh, because you have both of them sales.
Right.
Because you've got income and, okay.
in sales.
Yeah, but the instability, it's an interesting question of, do we make the reserve, the critique is that income is less stable than property.
Yeah.
But here, that suggestion is the income tax change is now responsible for all of the volatility,
It's not.
which seems like
Right.
seems like a lot.
But the sales tax is fairly new too, and since we
Yeah,
put
yeah,
this.
no, I mean, it's,
But we do have another reserve that,
Right.
so like there is there is already a reserve, yes.
Yeah.
so so it sounds like we're gathering data on what the reserve should be.
Right.
I still don't understand, I don't like the chronology of saying, sort of build the reserve, then kind of enact this. Though I agree there needs to be the reserve, but I could see that being accomplished next year. And then we're not saying that this goes, it's not going to be sort of triggered that way. So it seems to me more like that would be in the report is reserve needs to be X, and we would come up with a solution to the weighting and what tax needs to really kick this off. And you know what I mean? I don't know if that makes
So what would that be that we would figure out?
I mean, I would do it sooner than later, but
But when is sooner?
3 years.
But it's hard to know without testimony from tax of saying this is how long it would take. If we had the reserve today, how long would it take? Is that two
maybe
years?
that's the way to.
Well, and right now, we've had enough additional funding coming in to the ed fund so that we were able to lower tax rates and set some money aside. And so it's much easier in that economic scenario. If in a year, we're in an economic downturn and we're having to raise rates, I mean, it's just that when we do it, how fast we do it the timing is going to depend on a lot of outside forces.
For sure, but we're just coming up with a model.
Yeah.
Julia?
Throw maybe another wrench into the question sphere. Also, it might help to clarify things, is thinking about when and how the stabilization reserve would be used once it's filled up.
Right.
So in theory, you've built this stabilization reserve of whatever percentage or whatever number of dollars. Down the line, how is money drawn from that stabilization reserve and when? Are there any limits to when the General Assembly can decide to pull money out of that stabilization reserve? Is it up to the legislature's discretion, thinking about the use of that stabilization reserve, albeit I've heard it's used to make up the difference in stability between the property tax base and the income. But it's still, I haven't heard how those dollars.
So it's to keep rates from increasing by more than X% in a
Right.
given year.
And do we want to cap the, I mean, because these rates are going to be tied into our already existing income tax when we get rated nationally, and they aren't going to say you don't have any property tax. So should there be a cap? Can we go above a 10% in, education income tax? Or should we kick in the reserves when it looks like we're going to have to go up more than 1 or 2% a year?
I think that one thing that's also important to keep in mind in this conversation is that the education fund is sort of flipped on its head as compared to other funds. So the amount of revenues that need to be raised ultimately depends on spending decisions. So with respect to how much our rate's going to raise by, that in large part depends on education spending decisions at the local level. Under current law, you all can apply surplus to lowering those tax rates as you see fit. I think that there's a question about the incentives of using that surplus to lowering tax rates if will be a stabilization reserve that kicks in to cap tax rates increasing, and the question of how that stabilization reserve will be maintained over time. If that makes sense.
I think we're going to have to.
Can always be not withstood, that's the problem. And as you're saying, if we said, let's say its purpose is to keep increases at no greater than 5% or something, but then voters approve a 7% increase, that's sort of cheeky. They're rating by the formula. And so.
And then if that happens over a span of years, the stabilization reserve will be completely depleted.
Right.
So then what?
Yeah. That's what she's asking.
That's asking the committee.
Well, we'll have to have a way to regularly refill the reserve pretty much the way we do now.
Yeah.
Sure, but it would be self-defeating if, it would cancel itself out.
If it only,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, and again, we don't know how this is going to affect votes. Right now, you raise the property tax, well, I can afford it, but then there's, my next door neighbor who's on a fixed income who can't. For poorer communities, if this really is the rich people in Chittenden County that are going to pay for my schools, you might see a change in behavior. You might not.
It's hard.
No. We've tried to
There are a lot
stop
of poor
them from
people in Chittenden
spending.
County.
I know. There's poor people in
Most school
Woodstock.
budgets pass, right?
I'm just trying to think simply. I think we need a recommendation. Do we need one reserve or a second reserve? And what additional amount of money do we need to protect ourselves against the additional instability of using a 100% education income tax instead of an existing homestead tax, of which part of that is funded through income?
And I appreciate that. I think those are two questions that we need to leave open. The third question that I would tag onto that is, and I'm not saying leave open forever, I'm saying leave open until our next meeting.
Yeah.
But the third one that I would tag onto that, which maybe we can answer today, is when would it be used and how? Why we have to say in statute what the fund is actually for.
Well, I would just say, what does statute say about when the legislature can use the existing reserve fund.
It feels like never is the answer to that.
No,
Okay.
it's just, I think when you do, you pay a price
Yeah.
with being one, and you gotta fill it back up, and two, you get hit by Moody's, these are the two.
I'm pretty sure we used it during the last downturn. I just have an image of Steve Klein saying we had to fill it back up.
We used it,
It was
in one of the-
down. We used something.
we went down to like 4.5 one year, I don't remember
Yeah.
exactly why, but we filled it right back up,
Yep,
and,
but I know we had it down below.
but I think it's
I
3.5
guess-
to 5.
I guess the question for you two, maybe for our next meeting, is would the existing language around the reserve fund sort of serve for the purposes that we're talking about? And is there a reason, and we can talk to bond folks between now and then and see if someone can come in, is there a reason to have it be a separate fund, or can we just increase the existing fund?
I can read you the very first subsection if you like. It
Yeah.
won't answer many of your questions. It is so this is the stabilization reserve section. It is the purpose of this section to reduce the effects of annual variations in state revenues upon the education fund budget of the state by reserving certain surpluses in education fund revenues that may accrue for the purpose of offsetting deficits. So it's very broad.
But it doesn't really ever have a deficit.
No, they can't, they do have temporary deficits, cash flowy.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It could also have a deficit if the forecast
Yeah.
were to
It's off.
project
Yeah.
Yeah.
higher than actual non-property revenue sources.
Yeah.
Especially other income.
And then there's also a sentence that requires the joint fiscal committee to review if the stabilization reserve is ever less than 5%, even though it's more of a cap of not above 5%. If it goes below, JFC reviews the information provided in the December 1st letter and then provides a recommendation to the General Assembly about how to refill the stabilization reserve. So it's more of a mechanics. It doesn't get
We keep that.
decision-making, but I think that's probably intentional to allow the General Assembly that discretionary authority about what to do with the funding.
So it sounds like the language in the existing reserve covers what we've been talking about, but maybe as there's a second reserve, like related to bond ratings or something, that would make sense. Okay. We have 13 minutes left together today.
So the next meeting is our last?
The next meeting is our last.
December 16th, is that still the date?
Yes,
The 16th?
that's what Sorsha
Yes, it
says,
is.
and so it's
Right.
true.
We also have another date held.
But we're not,
I've
that
got the
date is.
27th or something. marked on my
21st,
calendar.
even worse.
21st.
That's just, leave it there. It's a threat to all of us.
Oh.
Okay.
25th, no, the city council in Montpelier has us in that night.
We would do something a little bit like today, except for far fewer questions.
We would have a draft report in front of us,
Yeah.
not a outline.
Yes.
And we would have all read it in advance and like,
Jeez.
and language matters there.
About the due date, Abby? Okay.
Yes.
Within that report, actually, as we were going through this, I was having the thought of, the discussion has been in the report, provide options. One of your deliverables is legislative language. But that could be fleshed out as much or as little as you would like. So where there are these big questions that are outstanding, they would not be addressed in the legislative.
And just flesh it out as much as you
We
can.
are the legislature. If we fail to meet our own requirements, who's going to yell at us?
Our colleagues.
On the other hand, we're pretty close.
I think we're actually,
I would like to see us file a bill, or not file a bill.
I mean, you won't be filing any bills.
No, I know.
Yeah.
That's probably where I'm coming from.
On
But
behalf of a constituent.
Yep. So there,
because I think actually, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't. I know you've done a lot of work on this in the past, and so is translating this to a piece of legislation like an unimaginable amount of work in 2 weeks, or is it something you've been drafting along, or?
Pieces of it. It depends on the level of detail and accuracy in the interaction of all the pieces that you want to drill down into. So absolutely I will provide you with legislative language, just the comprehensiveness of it there may be gaps in it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Which I can point out to you, but
Okay.
December 16th is our target for the report, and then pieces of that legislative language.
And we'd like to circulate the draft report in advance of the meeting.
So that means like, that's what I was going to point out. If we want to do that, then when would it really be due?
If it's by January.
No, if we have to, you want to have the public to see it before we meet, so the public could come in and say, what a great job.
Yeah, that's, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Didn't we put off stakeholders till the next meeting?
Yes,
We
that
would
that
have
would be the public,
stakeholders.
that would be the public that I think.
That would mean kind of like a shorter deadline than at least I was thinking.
Yeah.
It would be like the 12th-ish.
So we may have to push to the 21st. That's what I'm hearing.
We'll see.
Hopefully not.
We don't have to discuss that right now. What I want to wonder is, are there things that we need to go back to in the next 9 minutes? Do we need to, we talked about escrows. I just want to say about TIFs, there is likely an impact on TIFs if we do this. That impact might not be very large. We don't have a sense of how many homesteads are actually within TIF districts. Some TIF districts do have many, some districts probably don't have any. How that gets covered is an issue. I've flagged it for the league, who are one of the major TIF advocates and an advocate of this, and we can figure that out in the future. It is not something we're solving in this
I
committee.
have a constituent with a proposal for a TIF for housing.
Great. We can talk about that during the session.
What about how do we determine what, for somebody that's going to pay the EIT, but has moved around? Have we talked like,
Within a year.
Oh,
yeah, like what, like, let's say they lived one place when they voted, but
Different.
yeah, how do?
I was imagining they're
working.
paying the rate of where they live on January 1st.
Great question.
Okay.
But I think we just have to pick something like that in January of the tax year that they're paying for.
Yeah,
How
I
does
mean,
that
that's
sound?
what we do. If you're the owner of record on March 31st, you
Okay.
get the tax bill even if you sell the house on April 2nd.
So it's not the rate of where you live on January 1st, it's the rate for the place you live on, for the town you live in on January 1st.
Yeah.
It's still the blended rate for the
Where
year.
you're a resident of.
Where you're a resident on January 1st, you pay the blended rate for that year.
Okay.
You've got to have something.
Did you all catch that? Because that's something we haven't talked about.
Tenant.
Sorry, we were,
No, it's fine.
If they move out of state middle of the year, when they file their taxes, they're still January 1st, that's where you're a resident of, and this is your.
If they move out of state, then they only have allocable, is that how I pronounce that word?
Income, yes.
Apportioned
Right, the
income for
apportionment
that.
takes care of that
Yes,
situation.
yes.
Okay, all right.
But if they're moving from town to town, they are responsible for the blended tax rate of the town they're living in on January 1st.
Okay.
And there won't
Of the
be
tax year they're
any
paying for.
more income sensitivity, so when you sell a house, you won't have to prorate that.
Are there
You like that?
like random
There's happy.
Ts we didn't cross that we could cover in 5 minutes, or is that?
I did skip over a question about overpayments, and if it is a credit against the EIT for renters. Am I getting that right? As opposed to an exemption. Just wanted to point out that there could be, if there's an overpayment of the education income tax, that under existing statute, the Commissioner of Taxes can apply that to another.
Yes, please,
Okay, great. That.
in all directions. I think we wanted that existing statute to stay in all directions.
Yes, that was in that bucket of just apply how personal income tax is administered. Apply that to the, excellent, thank you.
one thing that we did mention we might come back to is the inflation factor on the statewide rate. I didn't know if you wanted to revisit that. We had there was a preliminary settling, I understood from the committee of MEP, unless anyone thought of something
MEP is some
Otherwise-
factor on top of it.
NEPA,
It's the, it's
Index, inflation index.
it's the inflation index that's the most closely tied to education costs.
Is that like, is that?
The salaries.
Fed.
Contracts kind of their default, like worker contract.
No,
I don't know, it's a default that we use in other places in the statute.
that'd be used for negotiations mostly, I think. When we've always used it for the excess spending threshold.
it's, the reason I referenced it is because I'm aware of that being used in other places in Title 16 as an inflationary adjustment.
I have another one,
Yeah,
so it's probably as
good as it.
good as anything to start out with.
Okay. Well,
Who will tell us why we're wrong?
Yeah,
Maybe somebody will tell us it's
No
the
one's
wrong
gonna
one
tell
down the road. I don't know.
that's fine. This has got a long way
So-
to go.
Other things?
I don't have anything on my list of things that are left to be discussed today. There are some things that I know you had deferred to just include in the report as still to be determined.
Great.
I don't know.
I think I will have more questions as we start writing the report.
Agenda.
I don't have any right now.
Every Tuesday.
Okay, I'm at a BSAC retreat and board meeting
One
next Tuesday.
I think with that, we are done for the day, and I thank
Yes.
everyone at the table, but especially Abby and
Yeah.
Julia for
Thank you.
fighting through this with us.
We do
Much
agenda
appreciated.
planning at least every Tuesday. Last week it was twice, along with getting out the December 1st letter and the